Um, so today's talk is rather ambitious as I hope to challenge you to think about education from a different lens and develop a new understanding and appreciations for the role of research and community. Normally, when I give presentations, I like to look around the room, engage with my audience, but perhaps you're fortunate that you are spared from this today. As Emily Dickinson would say, we'll sit you there, I here, with the doors ajar that oceans are, in this case, virtually. I have nothing to disclose. I wish I did. I wish I was being paid millions to give you a talk today, but this presentation represents my and my colleagues' views, which isn't necessarily Harvard or Columbia as a whole. Now, I know you all have vastly different backgrounds, so I don't want to lose you in the first minutes by talking about hepatomegaly and von Gierks right off the bat. So I hope to teeter on things that are colloquial and relatable while also introducing you to some new concepts. We'll begin with talking about education, something I'm sure you're all deeply familiar with. I dare say you probably have like a decade's experience with this. So let's look at a typical day of school. You're reading Shakespeare in Lit, memorizing some anachronistic details in history, and babying your sack of flour to represent parenthood or something, whatever they do for health classes now. And the whole point of this is you're given all of these details and you're asked to find the big picture. What is the lesson to be learned from these details? But does this method make sense for effective inquiry? Let's look at a colloquial example. So this is brought about by Dr. Chase, who is a physician here at Columbia, who had this demonstration of a night out that will fuel our discussion. So you're with a friend, and they ask, "What did you do last night?" And you say, "I ate some grilled salmon." The answer has been given, and now we continue from there. Why did you choose that? It was the special of the day. Oh, where at? Restaurant. The restaurant down the street. Yeah. Did you go alone? No, it was a night out with my family. Overall, it sounds like a pretty decent night. But your knowledge is built off that one point, the food. Without that example, you can't reach a bigger picture. You're reliant on that one small detail. From that small detail, you need to apply that information to the rest of the world. But if your base is erroneous or insufficient, then what you extrapolate becomes ineffective. Let's go back to the night out on the town example. So we ask, "What did you do last night?" And we flip it around. Notice that it all still exists, but rather than starting with the salmon, we'll start with the big picture and narrow down from there. The question I can ask from grilled salmon are quite limited, but a night out or restaurant raises the stakes and possibilities. And there's a chaotic variability to the world. Video, but it didn't play. That's fine. The world is not so linear. It is variable and changing. With many paths, we return to the restaurant. Notice we have an increased chance of a branch point. Seeing poor hygiene while sitting by the kitchen sounds more interesting than hearing about your fish. I want more details. Let's look even further up at the night out. Oh, it seems we left out the movie and the fire alarm. Was everyone okay? This is raising more curiosity. We also seem to have left out a subway robbery and tunnel accident. I want to hear about these emergencies, not the mundane salmon. My point is that an extraordinary amount of detail has been left out, and you are pigeonholed into focusing on the grilled salmon, when there was so much else going on that was more interesting and more pressing. If we had started with the big picture, it would have allowed for more flexibility to explore the more pressing information around us. Let's look at an average school day. It's all well and good. You're hammering out some details, same as before. And then this year has a plethora of occurrences that could define a generation, from Hong Kong, Australia, US elections, fires, coronavirus, police brutality, structural racism, so much more. Yet the school day largely remained the same. Resilience shouldn't mean rigidity that stifles creativity. Who's to say Hamlet is needed more now than something like The Invisible Man or The Soul of Care? Why focus on flower babies when a global pandemic provides the opportunity to talk about microbiology? Compounding this issue and making matters worse is that there is a strong prevalence of what is called in the literature first-order responses. Sure, there are basic foundations that are necessary for reaching more advanced stages of knowledge, and there's certainly plenty you have to memorize, but there's a need for problem solving at a higher level. Which is why I admire you all for participating in something like the IYRC. Joining a platform of creativity and discovery where you look for and hypothesize answers in an unknown. Which is a perfect transition into a conversation on research. We can't just memorize in research as the pathway is unknown. So we connect the dots to make sense of the unknown. Now, I'm not going to belabor this topic because you're all here and clearly conducted some form of research. So I thought I would walk you through one of my old research projects instead while connecting to this talk's theme. This was my senior thesis while at Harvard, and I fortunately received honors for it. But on the sides, you can see some macaques and Kit while they're doing some vision tests up here. And going to this, I'm making the assumption that you all have a basic understanding of what research is, but I'm also assuming you don't know anything about macaques, the brain, or the visual system at all. And that's going to be okay, because this time will be a perfect moment for you to step outside your comfort zone and think critically. It's unfortunate that you aren't in person, otherwise I would be listening to your thoughts. But even though we aren't in the same room, I want you to think of responses to yourself. Also, in the interest of time, I'll unfortunately have to skip some of the details. It's way too much and we could have a whole course on it itself. But I'll try and keep you up to speed and keep things relatively understandable. So we start with the big picture of the brain. We have a human and a macaque brain. What difference do we observe? From this image, you should immediately see that the size is different. Another difference is humans have more gyri and deeper sulci. The gyri are just the folds and sulci are the different grooves that you see in it. Overall, we'll say the human brain has a more complex structure. Can we agree on that? Fortunately for science, the macaque brain still houses many of the parts that can be seen in the human brain. Now, we were concerned with the visual system, so we start delving into the literature. Of particular interest to me was the inferotemporal cortex, abbreviated IT, sort of like that clown in that movie, Stephen King's book. IT is that part of the primate brain responsible for our ability to recognize objects. We have data of people who have strokes in inferotemporal cortex, who have problems in recognizing objects. So we know from the data that this is the area that we want to look at. IT in these images is the highlighted portion above the cerebellum to the left. Now, IT is absolutely amazing. It recognizes so many things. We could have a whole course on how amazing such a system is. It recognizes faces, places, text, bodies, objects, and even more. This should really raise some questions in your mind. How? How can I see a doll and a human and know with certainty that they are different? It's a crazy amount of specificity, but at the same time, when you look at me, you see my face from the front. But if I turn my head, you also see my face, and you still know it's me. You don't think it's suddenly a different person. Same with all the objects and faces you see. This means it's incredibly variable. This is one of the huge problems people are trying to solve with computer vision. Notice also that if we started with the question of what recognizes faces, we would have missed out on all of these other items that IT recognizes. We have to go from the big picture to the small, breadth to depth. This was a paper from a project I was fortunate to be a part of as a caregiver for the monkeys while doing my own project, which I'll talk about soon, but it should raise questions for you, especially during this time. it was found that monkeys who were raised without seeing faces formed abnormal face domains. This means infratemporal cortex, the same location above the cerebellum, isn't hardwired to be able to understand objects, but must develop to that point. And it does so remarkably within a critical period. My question is, if we have become a mask-wearing world here in COVID, what aspects could this have on these face-developing regions? Will we see more prosopagnosia, which is face blindness? It's an unknown. Anyway, the results of that experiment were fascinating since the monkeys' face recognition areas coded for hands instead of faces. And the reason is because the hands are the system or method of communication. And so that area IT ends up actually developing for communication. It's really interesting, but we'll go into more details since this was kind of a tangent. So in my thesis, I showed you a picture of a monkey in full gear, ready to watch TV. But we need to get from point A to point B. They need to be in the chair. They need to stay still. Have something around their neck that keeps them in place and not rocking back and forth. They need to be comfortable staring at a screen, all of which are unnatural to them. So since I need to get the monkey to be okay with something around its neck and not swat it, we need to find an approach. But just approaching them with it is difficult. The problem is they get scared, so we have to train them somehow. I don't know if you've ever tried to train a monkey or maybe a dog or something, but you can't just say sit. They won't just sit in the chair. You'd have to do a lot of work. So we condition them. We use classical conditioning and operant conditioning. Classical conditioning is involuntary. Operant is voluntary. How do we get them to be conditioned, though, is kind of difficult, but it's the same way that we get people to do things in general. You feed them. You ever had one of those days at school where someone tells you that today is someone you don't like's birthday or someone you don't really care about's birthday, and you think to yourself, all right, but then maybe your friend says, oh, that person brought cupcakes for everyone, and you're like, oh, well, I guess I should say happy birthday or something, because you want the cupcake. You'll change your behavior for food. So we feed them and give them activities to do. I have a video of a monkey in its cage presented with two choices, and whichever one it chooses, it gets that many drops of juice, which is the reward. The monkey will see various symbols on the screen, which are letters and numbers. The letters are in no particular order, but they represent different numbers. So X will represent 10, whereas something like Y will 11, W 12, so on and so forth until A 24, J 25. I hope this video works. Let me explain while it plays. Try again. Okay, so she chose M, which is 22 drops over 8. Now she chose A, which is 24 drops over 9. She gets juice reward through the metal sprout, a yellow dot appears when she touches the screen. Now you're going to see her baby, who isn't too good at this yet. And her baby just comes up to the screen and pushes C, which is 13 drops, over A, which is 24. Play it again while I explain a bit more. So for a human, we would probably have a lot more difficulty with this to a degree. Just in the English alphabet, A is before X, so we would probably say X is greater just naturally. The important thing to recognize is that we are dealing with monkeys. They don't know what A is. They don't know what letters are. It is the same as a baby. Letters and numbers are social constructs and symbols. They don't exist without us assigning meaning to them. English in that sense is terrible. When I say micro, you think small. When I say wave, you think of either an ocean or a hand. But when I say microwave, you don't think of a small hand or a small wave or ocean or something like that. It's all a sign. We'll go back to the research. Now we have our monkey who is comfortable and has his collar on. He isn't scratching. He knows how to play video games. He's golden, ready to go. Notice once again, we have to go from a broad array before we could get specific to what we actually want. We do this to make sure we don't leave anything out. So in the interest of time, I'm going to say there is a lot of equipment needed to situate the monkey, collect data, monitor the monkey during the test, ensure it gets rewards each time it goes around. So much to do. All of this has to happen automatically. It's a lot and not terribly important right now for the purpose of this talk, so we'll get into the data. So essentially, I wanted to test IT's ability to recognize objects, faces, etc. from different angles when a continuous motion is present versus a spontaneous motion. And I'll explain what I mean by that. So imagine the images as frames. If you go from A to B, frame 1 to 2, that is continuous. There's barely any change in the image besides the slight rotation. Now, image C, we'll say is frame 10. Going from A to C would be random or spontaneous because it's almost completely different. You can still tell that it's the same monkey, but it's still a completely different image that you're technically seeing. And that's because it just popped in front of you. You can tell that it is the same monkey. The presentation is quite different. I want you to ask you, would you expect more neurons to fire from frame 1 to 2 or from frames 1 to 10? If it helps, think about someone turning their head slightly in front of you. Is that startling? Now think about a horror movie with a jump scare when someone surprised you. You become immediately more alert. You would expect more activation. But interestingly, that is not the case here. I'll show you the data quickly as it gets quite complicated, but it was found that activation of neurons in inferotemporal cortex were higher for the continuous motion when compared to the spontaneous motion. This should be surprising to you. Let me orient you to these charts. So the left figure is absolute, and the right figure is relative. We had normal, which would be frame 1 to 2, random, which would be frame 1 to 10, and still, which is frame 1 and then 1 again. Blue is fewer firing. Yellow is greater firing. We can focus on the relative figure on the right for simplicity. So look at an intersection and see the same thing across all categories, that random is consistently less activation than normal and still. Normal is also consistently higher than stills, except in 2 categories of places and food, which are higher in still than motion. Why might places and food be higher in still images than in moving images? If you have the same hypothesis as I do, it would be because in the real world, your food and your room don't move. Bodies, hands, faces, they all move, but your food doesn't normally move. Instead, you move around it. But now we want to know why random in every category is lower than the continuous. And the hypothesis is quite complicated once again. Simply, it's this thing called on and off responses. I'm going to come back to this slide in a second, but to understand it, you need to know what the on and off response is. At our lowest level, our base visual ability, we don't see objects. All we see are gradients of contrast. I know, I just blew your mind right there. So we'll say this cell is excited by light on the left. And we'll also say that it loves to see dark on the right. So that would be the gradient. So in this case, the neuron is happy and firing because it has light on the left, where it likes light, and it has dark on the right where it likes dark. It's perfect. Based on that, would this neuron be happy in this case? You should all be shaking your head because this is the exact opposite of what this cell wants. It's not going to fire because there is darkness in the light-loving section, and there is light in the dark-loving section. Let's look back at the monkey again. So we have a face, right? Notice how there are distinct lines of darkness and light. This cell is happy as we go from frame 1 to 2. Then we see frame 10, and it's the exact opposite of what the cell liked. It's really similar to those black and white images I just showed before. Suddenly, we have a light on the left and a darkness on the right, so it stops firing. It's amazing. All right, I hope that was interesting for you to think and question throughout, starting from that big picture of the visual system and boiling down to a specific mechanism within, asking why and then what if. The problem is that research is not an end, but a means. There has to be a point after. This next part, I'll touch on the point of community application. And just to switch things up again, I'll go through a patient vignette. So picture yourself as a doctor, and a family comes to you with their baby. The baby is unresponsive. She is a 7-month-old infant that has not fed for a few hours. She's febrile, which means she has a fever. And palpating the abdomen, you notice an enlarged liver, which is hepatomegaly. The father mentions he is a type 2 diabetic. The baby lives at home with the family, and the mother works at a grocery store, and father works as an accountant. Before getting to you, the nurses performed a glucagon test, which does not improve the child's condition. With all this in mind, think about what could be the issue and how do you treat it. Now, this is what you used to do. You look from small to large. Father is diabetic. Child must be diabetic. Let's give metformin, which is a common thing that you give. It increases insulin susceptibility. But this would lead to death. Why? The thought process has been pigeonholed into this one theory and ignores key information. This process mistakes disease names as a cause of symptoms, but disease names are a social construct for a collection of symptoms. Instead, we have to look at the key information from the data we have. Febrile is kind of important, since it tells us immune system is functioning, but we're really not learning information beyond that without some tests. The father with type 2 diabetes is not really relevant. If it was a mother, we could think of some complications during pregnancy. It could be a macrosomic baby with hyperglycemia or something like that. If it was the father with type 1 diabetes, we could argue inheriting the low insulin states. But type 2 is a father. It's not likely to be a culprit. How about social history? In this case, it's not helpful at all. The father being an accountant versus a lawyer doesn't change the baby's state at all, though it might put the medical team a bit more on edge. If the mother was a surgeon or a coal miner, that could be a clinically relevant detail for various reasons, some of them being stressed mother complicate the pregnancy, the issue with breastfeeding, all the toxins from the coal mine transferring to the baby. But grocery store and accountant are rather benign. So now we have our big picture of some key symptoms in the case and can start the detective work. We need a differential diagnosis. So we start with our big picture. What were the key aspects of this child's case? We need to take all of this and bring it together to find what is the illness. Let's start with unresponsive, as that was the chief complaint. The patient was unconscious. It has to be something with the brain. The central nervous system is our center of consciousness, but what could cause a loss of consciousness? Many factors could. In the context of this child, it could be injury or lack of nutrients to the brain. We didn't receive any reports of damage to the head, but it could be subdural, so we can't just rule it out. But we can't just jump to it, because there's an amazing connection we can already make. The brain definitely needs glucose to function. And what did the mother say? This baby is not eaten in a few hours. Glucose levels must be low. Hypo means low. Like glucose, emia, blood, hypoglycemia, low blood glucose. It all makes sense. Many things can cause low blood glucose. Well, we know we are dealing with a baby that is only 7 months old. She isn't suffering from a chronic condition at this age. Around 7 months is when babies start to switch their diet to include more foods like fruits and whatnot. This could be a direction. But let's look at that acute part, because it provides a nice connection. My slides are skipping around, sorry. Baby hasn't eaten. Hypoglycemia is also acute. This is all making sense, but there's to be more to it because we've all had days where we didn't eat for a few hours, but we didn't become unresponsive. Also, if this was just hypoglycemia, we would not get an enlarged liver. Also, glucagon, which functions opposite of insulin, would have produced the necessary glucose. We have to look deeper. So the liver is enlarged. Something must be building up in the liver. We don't know what yet. Now let's look at that glucagon test. Glucagon didn't work, which means the normal function of glucagon, which are to create glucose, are not working. Glucose, neo, new, genesis, beginning. Gluconeogenesis, create new glucose. Glycogen, storage form of glucose. Lysis, break. Glycogenolysis, break down glycogen. Once again, words make sense. We have a connection now between this buildup of glucose in some form or glycogen in some form connected to this something building up in the liver. We can make that connection. And it turns out to be the case. Glucose 6-phosphate is glucose with a phosphate on it. When glucose has a phosphate on it, it can't leave cell. So the phosphate group becomes prevalent on that glucose, sticking it within the cell, preventing it from leaving. And this leads to hepatomegaly. Once again, we have a great connection. And this is perfect because you can't get glucose out of the liver. You're lacking glucose throughout your body, so hypoglycemia. We got it. We found our culprit. This situation has a name associated with it. And it is von Willebrand's, the glycogen storage disease type 1. We started with the big picture and then broke down to the details. Now we can start to treat it. The treatment in this case would actually be cornstarch or regular glucose, and the reason for that is because the patient cannot break down glycogen, fats, or proteins to make glucose. We need glucose to survive. Thus, we give the things that we don't have. It's not that complicated, right? If you don't have something, you add it and it's fine. If there was no door to your room and you needed a door, you would add a door. Simply. Cornstarch is a polysaccharide, multi. So we can give that since we can break down sugar still. Both a polysaccharide or frequent glucose would help provide a steady supply of glucose. Now the baby is back to consciousness and smiling, but we can't stop there. And why? Because there's so many effects that could be going on. Downstream outcomes such as hypoglycemia, diabetes, hospitalization, and COVID are all what we observe as the results. There are mid and upstream factors that limit one's ability to have access to high quality care. And and this prevents them from being able to promote their own health, which is the essence of the social determinants of health. The social determinants of health are quite complex. There's many, many factors that play into someone's health, and I'll quickly walk you through, but economic stability over on the left side includes things like employment, food insecurity, housing instability, poverty. Education on the bottom left is early childhood development, high school graduation, enrollment in higher education, language, things like that. Social and community context. Over at the bottom right is civic participation, discrimination. Health and healthcare on the right would be access to care. And then neighborhood and built environments would be things like having high quality housing or protection from environmental conditions. But learning social determinants of health is not just meant for isolation, but to be put in practice. So there are plenty of ways for youth to be innovators, to provide care for others through projects that make a difference in lives by putting ideas into action. So I hope you took something away from all of this, and I just want to reiterate some points before we go. Look at the big picture, not just the small details. Expand your knowledge to include context of the world. Don't live stagnant in isolation. Do research and think logically. Let the data drive action. And share information with others. Collaborate and create interventions that benefit society. Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes my talk. Now it is your turn. I look forward to seeing the differences you create. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul, so much for all of that information. I wish my AP Bio students were here to hear all of that. But I think we have some great biology researchers here who hopefully have some questions for you on the science. But I'll open the floor to any questions for Paul about his research experience, about med school, and about his community engagement projects as well. We have a small enough crowd that I think if you wanted to raise your hand, I can call on you and you could unmute yourself if you'd like. If you're not comfortable with that, you're welcome to send a message through the questions function and I will read it aloud for you. I'll give you a moment to gather your thoughts.
Don't worry, I completely understand. Oh, I admire you all so much for doing this in high school. Oh, and I'm amazed with... Oh, you go, Elizabeth.
I was going to ask you, Paul, so at what point in your kind of academic career did you know that med school was the right path for you?
Yeah, that's a good question. So in high school, I was thinking of medicine because it was such a diverse field. Medicine's so fascinating in the sense that it encompasses so much that it allows you to, if you enjoy hearing people's stories and giving people a voice, it's there for you. If you enjoy the hard science and the research, it's there for you. If you enjoy doing more advocacy things around people, it's there for you. It has so much to it that I really enjoyed that aspect, and it combined a lot that I was doing in high school. But then I didn't really know that it was for sure medicine until I was in college. While I was in college, my mom ended up being diagnosed with leukemia and lymphoma. And so her situation really helped me to reevaluate what I wanted to do in medicine, because at the time I was in a whole different state from her. And not being able to be present and not really being able to care for someone so close to me was kind of, it was an unfortunate situation in that sense. And after reflecting and taking some classes related to caregiving and death and the dying and things like that, it really helped me develop an interest in something called palliative care. Palliative care is caring for end of life or the dying situation. And so that's when it really started to click that medicine was what I wanted. not for the same reasons as before, but because of the aspects of dignity present within it. So then I ended up, I received a fellowship from Harvard, and that's how I ended up meeting everyone over in Japan. And it was a great time, but getting to really see the dying, really be present with others, I think was such a touching and heartwarming feeling. It really shifts the whole gear and the whole approach of what medicine is presented as. Because when we think of medicine, we always think about curing or healing. But in the case of palliative care, everyone's going to die. There's no question about that. And so you're really switching that paradigm to really focus on, rather than curing this person, how can we just be present with them and promote their dignity in this end? The same person who's been present in our society, probably contributed so much to everyone's well-being. Instead of casting them out, we need to be present with them. And a lot of health systems, unfortunately, kind of just look at the elderly as like, all right, go on. And it's an unfortunate thing. So I was really wanting to become a physician to be present in the system that really cares for the dying.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that personal connection with us. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. I'm an open book.
Are there any questions from the audience? Yes, we have a question from Molly. Molly says, that was so great, Paul. You blew my mind with the tidbit about how all of the isolation we're experiencing with COVID might affect IT development / facial recognition ability in children. Are you seeing new research projects emerge on this front?
It's a very good question. I am not completely within the literature on that right now. Medical school has been quite busy for me. But I have seen a lot of deprivation in children education research, and then I have seen a lot of developments in IT. And I'm wondering if there has been developments within that front. Computer vision has been a kind of, well, it's a battleground in a sense, because it's a desire to be able to just see an image of some kind and be able to pinpoint, oh, that's a dog, or specifically that's a German Shepherd or something like that. But it's getting to a point where there's also some biases that it's created, and misidentifying people, especially people of color and things like that, or not being able to really pinpoint, really having trouble with all different types of angles rather than just one. So it's quite a difficult situation. I really wish I knew more about the literature to see about if the wearing masks is really impacting face. I think it's a concern that I wonder if we'll see in the next couple of years of children that just like don't respond to smiles as much, or don't respond to mouth movements because it's kind of foreign. But I'm not also a little on the positive end, because I think people tend to not wear masks so much in home versus in public, but it's still a concern.
Yeah, great, thank you. We actually coincidentally do have a couple of, I don't know if specifically computer vision, but computer science crossed with medical research, actually a few different projects. So I hope that they'll check out this presentation when it's done. We did get a question regarding whether or not these presentations would be recorded. And yes, they are. They are being recorded, and we hope to make them available after the conference for participants as well as kind of the broader community to access. So do please remind your students as well, if they are willing to share their research. It's not required, but we hope that you do allow us to share those videos and kind of advertise your hard work. So yes, are there any other questions? Senna asks, thank you for your presentation. Could you expand on your thoughts towards the beginning of the presentation on the nature of research in general?
Yeah, when you say nature of research in general, look, I think, were you talking about like, scroll back a bunch? Were you talking about like, once I started talking about my research, or was it more like before? I can go talk about both. I think one of the issues is that a lot of times, so research is complicated because there are places certainly for the model of that you get stuck in just looking at the grilled salmon. If there's like one particular gene that you're just questioning what it does, but it kind of makes it really difficult to do. You have to kind of look at the big picture and kind of boil down from there. And the important thing for that is that with research in general, you want to really ask more questions and really delve into information. You don't just want to be stuck with what you're presented with. And by that, I mean, like, if someone tells you, if someone told you the sky is blue, yeah, you can look at it and say the sky is blue. But that's also just because we've defined the sky as blue. Like, that color, that shade that we see is blue. But if someone was missing their blue cones, cones are in the eye, part of your visual system. If someone was missing that blue cones, they would be like, oh, the sky's gray because they don't see blue. And so that's the whole point of it, is like, you want to, with research, you want to get as much data as you can and not just take everything at face value, but really start to question what you see and try and delve into that further. And it's something that will really help you along the way of like, not just taking everything at face value, but really questioning what's in front of you. And that helps to avoid a lot of the pitfalls that can happen from kind of, I don't want to go into politics, but political atmosphere is like the top thing of people just following without doing their own research or without trying to understand. Hope that sort of answered your question about broadly about research. I could go into more detail. But I see there's another question. If anything, I'll come back and talk more. As someone in medicine, what are your advices to young students, researchers thinking about COVID-19? What do you think are interesting areas to research, think about in the future? Well, COVID-19 has presented so much going on. It's really redirected science, I think. One of the issues is that a lot of the in-person studies can't happen like they used to before, which was really limiting in collecting of data. But on the other end, a lot of systems have adapted to a new virtual technology-driven world of like making sure everyone there's like a list of emails and everything for everyone, especially if you're doing something global health related, maybe in sub-Saharan Africa or something like that. And so there's more opportunities in that sense for connecting globally. But there's also a limit now on tests being able to be done in person. It also creates, COVID-19 has also created a fear of like recruiting participants. I know some of the doctors I work with have been having trouble with their own research because people don't want to go out to join studies. But then on the flip side, studies, usually when they're done, people get paid a certain amount. And it's supposed to not be enough that it would really change someone's perspective and really be a super large benefit to them. But with COVID-19, a lot of people are losing their jobs and losing their income and losing a lot of the stability that they had before. And so even like if your study gives $20, it's still like, oh, that's probably food for that day or two for that person. And so like it's a very difficult situation that COVID-19 has created for doing studies in general. But advice for young students, researchers thinking about COVID-19, I would say try and connect with people older who are established in those fields who I'm sure would be happy to have more people on board, especially if you're familiar with data analysis or things like that. And try and think about not just COVID-19 as the microbiology aspects, but also the social aspects. That could be mental, housing, all those social determinants. And then also what the post-COVID world would be like and what opportunities are there in this current environment to still provide people with similar experience to before. I think one of the other things with COVID is or not everyone's, but a lot of schools around the world have gone to this virtual platform. And like right now, I don't really see any of your faces, which is like kind of a shame, but you kind of end up in this isolated bubble. And so how to provide those experiences for others that they're not just sitting in isolation, but being present with others. Thank you for that question.